Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Are we all warm already?
Yes.
Good. Well, I have a story from my youth to share with you all. A story about two very frightened young 17-year-old soldiers and a rather sad old man. But first, let me introduce myself. Harry Kay, private of the 8th Battalion Seaforth Highlanders. And let me take you back to the day I arrived at Lewes, just out of our basic training, and we were dumped on the border with Belgium outside this little town. And you can imagine standing on the top of a low ridge that the Allies had. Going down was an enormous trench system into the valley bottom. Lewes was over there to the right, and on a low hill opposite there were more German trenches to match our own. And we were young, we were fit, we were keen, we wanted to fight, we were fresh out of training. And what did the army have us do for nearly a whole month? Filling sandbags. That was all we did, digging holes and filling sandbags. And all these sandbags went into the trench systems to make them bigger and higher and stronger. And I was 17. I'd never been away from home before, never mind being to France, never mind being involved in a war. And I had all my friends, my comrades out of my battalion and out of my platoon. But I needed somewhere to go, somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could read, where I could try and get my head round where I was and what I was going to do. And I found a dry shell hole behind our lines. Nobody seemed to bother with it. And I used to go in there for the odd half hour, read a book or something, and just try and steady myself. And one day, somebody else was sitting in the bottom. An officer by his uniform, a green uniform of the Irish Guards. And I looked at him. This isn't fair. And he was a young man. He didn't look any older than me. And although I was a private and he was an officer and we weren't supposed to talk, I introduced myself. And he seemed glad to talk. And we settled in the bottom of this shell hole, and we introduced ourselves. Harry Kay, Jack Kipling. Kipling, I know that name. Yes, Kipling is my father. And I thought that was wonderful. I loved the Jungle Book. I loved all the stories about the animals. Do you like the Jungle Book? Yeah. But I liked him most of all. That was the best adventure story for a boy ever written, in my opinion. It was wonderful. And we started being friends already. We started swapping stories about our families and who we lived with. And we swapped stories about where we came from. And I came from a Mancunian coal mining town. And I lived in a 2 up, 2 down. And I shared one bedroom with 3 other brothers. And we had a very small yard and a midden heap at the bottom. And Jack was telling me he lived in this great big country house with servants and an enormous garden and a pond and a farm and a river and a mill. I thought, we don't have that much in common after all, do we? But we still became friends. We met for well over a month whenever we could. It was nearly every day, possibly, just for half an hour in the evening. And we even swapped letters that we got from home. We knew everything about each other. We became the best of friends. It was lovely. Until the middle of September. The army was told we were going to have a big attack on Sunday, the 25th of September, 1915. I was going to be in the first wave, but Jack and his regiment, the Irish Guards, were going to attack 2 days later, a bit further north, and he was being withdrawn to the rear lines. So we said our goodbyes, we shook hands, we hoped everything would go well for each other, because we've been sharing it. We were so excited, we wanted to do our stuff in the war, we wanted to do our stuff for England, but we were also very, very frightened. And he left. And we settled down for the attack. It was going to be a long attack. There was going to be a 3-day barrage of shells all the way down the front line. And all these shells were going to break all the barbed wire. They were going to collapse all the German trenches. They were going to collapse all the German dugouts. They were going to kill all the Germans, and just in case anybody might be left alive in all that stuff, we were going to attack under cover of gas, chlorine gas. The first gas attack that the Allies had made in the war. The weather forecasters, and we all know how good they are, said that the wind would blow the gas into the German trenches and it would incapacitate anybody else who was left. And we knew that wouldn't work. We had gas masks. And do you know how good the gas masks were? They were an ordinary canvas sack treated with some chemicals with 2 little glass lenses sewn into them. You couldn't breathe in them, the gas went in them anyway, and you couldn't see out of them. But that's what was going to happen. And the barrage started. Now you think about the highest possible wave you can think of, crashing down on a beach, all day, every day, an enormous thunder. That's what it was. My ears rang, my head spun, the ground shook. It didn't stop 24 hours a day for 3 days. You had to keep your head down. There was earth and shrapnel flying all over everywhere. And then on Saturday night we were ordered into the trenches in full kit, tens of thousands of men crawling into all the communication trenches, going further towards the front trenches, all under cover of darkness. And it had to be silent. No talking, no lights, no nothing. And there we spent Saturday night crouched in this wet, cold trench. The barrage going on right in front of us. And then at 5 o'clock it stopped. But my head was still ringing. My ears were still ringing until I realised it was the gas gongs, the gas bells warning for us to put our gas masks on, which we struggled into. And then the gas shells came over. And if you peeped over the parapet, you could just see no man's land beginning to get filled with this greenish white gas. And slowly, as more shells piled in, this cloud rose until it was like an enormous fog bank 50 feet high and stretched as far as you could see on either side. It was like a fog bank that you might see on the sea, out of which a pirate ship might sail, just like happens in my books back on my shelves at home. But then at 6 o'clock, the whistle started, the sign for the attack, and you could see men beginning to climb up the trench ladders onto the trench parapet, and they marched into this white fog and slowly disappeared, wave after wave after wave of them, spookily disappearing into this fog. And as I inched closer to the front trenches, I'd had my basic training, I had my rifle, but I didn't know whether if I had a German in my rifle sights who might have a son my age back home, could I pull the trigger? If I had a young German soldier ready to be bayoneted, would I be able to do that? At the time, I had absolutely no idea whatsoever how I was going to react. But I was in front of a ladder and I was shaking like a leaf as I climbed up onto the top. My rifle kept on slipping off my shoulder, and then I marched into this fog. It was so thick I could hardly see my feet. We were tripping over everything in no man's land, over bits of barbed wire, in and out of shell holes. Some of these shell holes were so big they were half full of water, and we had to wade through them. And you saw this extraordinary sight of the kilts floating up around the men like enormous great big lily leaves. And then we had to climb out the other end. And there were machine gun bullets suddenly coming past us, and all of a sudden there were lines of barbed wire we had to climb over. Why hadn't this been broken, and who's trying to machine gun us? And then all of a sudden we realised what was happening. We walked out of this fog bank into the bright dawn, and there we were, beautifully silhouetted against this fog bank. And the German machine gunners were as active as anything. But we had to attack, and we just advanced in and out of these shell holes. John, one of my best friends, I'd only known him since basic training, but he was more of a friend to me than some of my brothers were. He was standing right next to me, and all of a sudden, like in slow motion, he sort of unzipped all the way up his chest. He'd been hit by shrapnel, and one of my best friends was there, dead beside me already, and I had to carry on with the battle. And so we carried on, and then it was then that my training clicked in. I had a machine gunner in my sights. I pulled the trigger, and he slumped over the gun. And before his mate could pull him off and get the machine gun turned on us, I jumped into his trench and used my bayonet on him. And after that, it was hand-to-hand fighting all the way into Lewes. And Lewes, after that barrage, was just broken bits of buildings. And we were fighting around stumps of buildings and in and out of exposed basements. And we came across 6 German soldiers hiding in the basements. We didn't know what to do with prisoners. We hadn't had any orders, and there weren't enough of us to deal with them. So after we used bayonets on them, we shut the door behind us as the blood ran out underneath, and we just carried on. And we suddenly realised by lunchtime, and I knew it was lunchtime because I was very hungry, we got to the other side of Lewes. We'd won our first battle. I was very proud. My first battle, and we'd won. James, my other friend, and I huddled behind a wall, and we shared some water and a couple of biscuits. We also shared a look that belied the fact that we knew we weren't 17-year-old boys anymore. We were men. What we'd done over the past 8 hours beggared belief. The things we'd seen. We were completely different people. But then it was our next. We had to go after Hill 70, which was on the far ridge. It was a German machine gun post, heavily defended, made out of concrete. And we had to. The Germans had left virtually, so we marched up the hill, in and out of the barbed wire, in and out of the trenches, in and out of the shell holes. But there were still bullets coming from miles away and shells from miles away. And John, he suddenly yelled, held his leg and fell into a shell hole. I jumped him after. He'd been hit in the leg, and my other best friend was injured. I put a field dressing on him and hoped there were medics coming up from behind us, but I had to leave him. And we got to the top of Hill 70 just as night fell. And our second objective, we had won it. And we settled down for the night. And we waited for the dawn, and we waited for reinforcements. The dawn arrived, like it always does, but the reinforcements didn't. And as the sun came up, we realised we were exposed to several other German machine gun posts behind us. We were going to have to retreat to stay alive, and that's what we did. We all erupted out of the trench at the same time, going pelting back down the hill, arms and legs waving everywhere, yelling, "Don't shoot us, we're British!" And there were machine gun bullets coming past, shells going over, men were falling on either side, and all of a sudden I got yanked off my feet, and I've not been hit, and my kilter got caught on some barbed wire, and I couldn't get it off, and there were machine gun bullets getting closer and closer. And in the end, the only thing I could do was to take my kilt off, and I must have looked a right sight. Running down that hill, arms and legs akimbo, yelling my head off, wearing what Scotsmen wear underneath their kilts. And no, you're not going to find out today, am I? But we got back to Lewes, and the town had been properly occupied now, and because we were in the first wave, we were allowed back into some of the rear trenches to relax. And you know what was in the rear trenches? There was hot, sweet tea. There were bacon sandwiches. There was bully beef stew. 2 days of fighting on water and biscuits didn't do us much good, and we ate and we ate and we ate. And then when we'd eaten all of that, we wanted some more, and there was somebody else coming up the trench with some more cans of stew, and we started helping ourselves until we realised that that cook was crying his eyes out because this had been cooked for his own platoon, none of whom had come back. That night, all I could think of, I was awake all night, all I could think of was seeing that enormous cloud, those men marching into it and disappearing, hearing the shells and the bullets and the screams. And the next day, I wanted to write home. I wanted to share my experiences with Annie and my parents. And I tried every which way to write down how I felt, what it meant to me. And I couldn't put it down. I couldn't find the words. And this is the postcard I actually wrote home at the end of the day. And do you know what it says on it? Just a remembrance from somewhere in France. Somewhere in France, for 1,000,000 miles from the rest of the world. And this was the battle that young Jack Kipling was going to go into that day. He was going to attack Chalkpit Wood, about a mile to the north of Lewes. And we knew that was a big German gun emplacement. And they were going to attack under cover of smoke this time. And this time the wind did actually blow the smoke in the right direction. And we could see it about 1.5 miles away. And we could hear the machine guns going off. And there was an awful lot of machine gunning. And at the end of that battle, at the end of the month of that battle, half my battalion were dead. All of them, young virgin soldiers, just like me, and James, and John, and Jack, because Jack never came back. Nobody knew anything about him, but he never came back. So the rest of my war, in 1916 I was posted west to Bapaume, where I fought in the battles of the Somme. And in 1917, in the coldest, wettest weather ever recorded, I first fought at Arras and then at Passchendaele. 1917 for me was a cold, wet hell. 1918, I was fighting back at Arras. Then I moved to Soissons. And then by November, I was in Douai for the armistice. What a wonderful time. The celebrations, the singing, the dancing, the drinking, the womanizing, and the remembering friends who never got that far. And through all those 4 years, I fought with my friends, I fought with my comrades, and anybody knows anything about the forces knows what comradeship means. It means about being there for each other. It means fighting for each other. You're all there, you're all wearing the same kit, you're all eating the same food, you're all losing the same friends, you're all fighting the same enemy, you're all living in exactly the same place, but you were there for each other. When it was too hot, when it was too cold, when it was too wet, when it all became too much, which it often did, when you didn't have enough food, when you didn't have enough water, you were there for each other. And I'm not going to be maudlin. An awful lot of fun things happened in the trenches. I can remember 2 examples. One was on the Somme. We'd just taken a big German trench, and we were too busy defending it to try and clear it, and there was this great big fat dead German lying in the middle of a trench, on a junction between 2 trenches, and we had to step over him, and he was in the way until somebody thought, well, you just step on him and walk over it, and suddenly realised that when you stepped on his tummy, his lovely big yellow and purple tongue popped out. We thought it was hilarious. 2 days we had fun with this. It was great. Until somebody stepped on him too hard and something burst inside. And there was another time, Passchendaele, where it rained all the time, but we never had enough water. One day, 3 of us were sitting underneath a canopy with our backs to the trench wall with water cascading off it. and some hopeful was coming up the trench with a kettle, asking, have you got any water? We haven't had any water for 3 days, but tell me when you find some, please. And he said, well, what about all this water here? And I said, look, there's 3 dead Germans on the top of that parapet, and all that water's washing through them. You can have it if you want. And he looked at us and said, well, I'm only making some tea for the officers. They'll never know, will they? So we collected the water and we laughed our heads off as he disappeared off up the trench. And the next day he came back and he said, thank you for the water. And he gave me a billy of tea, and it was made with proper tea, and it was made with proper milk and proper sugar. I'd not seen a cup of tea in 2 weeks, and it tasted wonderful. And I gave him his billy back and I said, where'd you get the water in the end then? And he grinned at me and said, well, that was the last of the water I took off you yesterday. Cheeky, he was off before I could get him now. But it was fun. Getting letters from home or sending letters. You saw that postcard. Well, here's another postcard. The army would take a picture of you. See, that's a young, handsome me. And you're supposed to say yes at this point. And they'd print it on postcards for you, so you could send them home. I've got lots of blank ones of these at home. Seems I didn't write home often enough. But the best things were getting Red Cross parcels, because you could share them with your comrades. People smoked more than others, some people liked chocolate more than others, and some people needed soap more than others. You could share amongst your comrades, it was good. And in 1919, in February, we were finally demobbed. Now, I know this sounds a bit silly perhaps, but it was a very sad time. I've been sharing my life for nearly 5 years with these men, and we shared the most extraordinary circumstances. We'd done the most extraordinary things together, and we were saying goodbye to each other for the very last time. We were potentially not going to see each other ever again. But we did go home in the end. But living with those men reminded me of a piece of prose. Now everybody remembers in primary school, you sometimes had to learn a bit of prose and you had to spout it off in front of the class. You didn't necessarily know what on earth you were talking about, but so long as the teacher could see that you'd actually learned something, they were happy. Well, living with these men and seeing their almost casual day-to-day comradeship and bravery amongst all their peers suddenly put this whole thing in context, and I think I've remembered the whole thing, and I'll share it with you if I may. This day is the feast of St. Crispian. Any who see today will stand a tiptoe when they hear that name and rouse themselves to the name of Crispinian. Any who see today and live to old age will, on the vigil, feast their neighbours and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's day. And he shall strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I got on Crispin's day. Old men forget, and all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages the feats he did that day. And so shall our name in his mouth, like household words, Harry the King, Exeter, Salisbury, Gloucester, shall in their cups be freshly remembered. But this story shall the good man tell his son, so that Crispin Crispinian shall ne'er be forgot from this day to the ending of the world, but in it we shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For any who shed his blood with me this day shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen abed in England shall feel accursed that they were not here, and shall hold their manhood cheap, while they hear any speak that fought with us on Crispin's day. We were that band of brothers, and we did things that gentlemen abed in England just couldn't comprehend. Anyway, we got home, and I paid a few visits that I promised I'd do in my 4 years fighting. Now the families were always very glad to hear stories about their Johnny, about how he lived and about how brave he was, and sometimes about how he died. But whenever the door closed behind me and I walked off down the street, I could feel their eyes on my back, and I could feel them thinking, why is he still alive and my Johnny isn't? I've never answered that from this day to the next. But there was one special visit I wanted to make. I remembered Jack. I remembered Jack telling me about his father's love for him and him being proud. And I also heard through the war about how Kipling had gone back to the front to try and find his son in all that carnage. And I also remember reading the poem that Kipling wrote about Jack and the loss of Jack, and I'll share it with you if I may. Have you news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. When do you think that he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Has anyone else had word from him? Not this tide. For what is sunk will hardly swim, not with this wind blowing and this tide. Oh dear, what comfort can I find? None this tide, nor any tide, except he did not shame his kind, not with that wind blowing and that tide. Then hold your head up all the more, this tide and every tide, because he was the son you bore and gave to that wind blowing and that tide. So I got a librarian friend of mine to find Kipling's address, and I wrote to him saying that I'd met Jack before the Battle of Lewes and that we'd become friends, and did he want to know anything. And I got an almost immediately reply, even with some money for the fare. And it was a heck of a journey to get down here. Slow train from Manchester, buses all the way through London, an even slower train down here, then a pony and trap to the front of the house. And there I was, standing outside the garden. This is a bit different from a Mancunian mining town. It was quiet and it didn't smell. And I looked at the house and I remembered Jack describing the tall chimneys. And I walked up to the door and I pulled that enormous iron bell pull, and a servant answered. I'd never met a servant before. What did I talk to them about? But he showed me in, and there in the hallway was Elsie, his daughter, who welcomed me and took me to Kipling's study. And there was Kipling himself sitting at the table. He got up and shook my hand and gave me a cigarette and sat me down and ordered me some tea. And then he asked me about my war and how I was getting on back at home. And he started talking about how important it was to get all the rest of the troops back from France, because there were still tens of thousands of wounded left over there even towards the end of 1919. And he talked about how important it was for proper memorials to go up. And he talked about all the work he was doing for the War Graves Commission. He didn't mention Jack at all. And then he went quiet and he looked out of his window for a while, puffing on his pipe, and I just left him for a moment. And then he suddenly said, let's go for a walk in the garden. And Elsie joined us, and we walked out of that door and round towards the pond, and then up the river towards the mill. And then he asked me about Jack, how I knew him. And I told him a story about two very frightened little boys becoming friends in the madness that was the front in 1915. I talked about us sharing stories about our families and about our lives and where we lived, and about what we wanted out of the war, and about what we wanted to come home to. By this time we were standing by the tree, I recognised the tree. That was a tree that Jack used to climb up when he was even younger. And he stopped and then brought out of his pocket some soldiers' dog tags, and he showed them to me, and it had Jack's name and regiment and number on, and he said Jack had lost his about 2 weeks before he went into action, and he'd written home asking for more because the army was rubbish at supplying things like that, and his father had got them ready to go in the post the day he heard that his son had disappeared. And he held them like they were the family jewels. If his son had been wearing these, he wouldn't have been lost. He would have been recognised and found, and his remains properly buried and marked. By this time, Elsie had walked off by herself and was very quiet. And he said, "Wait there a moment." And he went into the house. And he came out a few minutes later with this, a copy of Kim, my favourite book, and he'd signed it as well. And he insisted on me being driven back to the station. But after that, I had to make a life for myself. So I married Annie and we had children. Certain things keep on coming round. My son won the military medal in Normandy in 1944. He was only 18. But people have asked me how the war changed me, how the war might have changed other people. Well, to begin with, I gave up with religion very early on. I used to be very keen on chapel when I was in Manchester, but after seeing all that waste in the war, I couldn't believe there was a God who would let that happen to anybody. And I've had nothing to do with Remembrance Sunday ever since. The friends that I knew, the friends that I lost are up here. I hear their voices every day. I see their voices every day. I hear their laughter every day. They deserve more than one day's remembrance a year. And after all that crawling through the mud, I like to be nice and neat and tidy, and I like very well manicured fingernails. And I still enjoy the rum ration. Cheers, everybody. And people have asked, what were our dreams? What did we want to come home to? Well, it was the same for Jack and I. It was the countryside. Now, you've seen posters, recruiting posters of the handsome English soldier, just like me, and you agree with me again there, peering over the English countryside. Well, that's what it was about. The English countryside personified everything to do with England that we were fighting for. Now, Rupert Brooke won the war poet. I've heard it said that he couldn't write for the common English soldier like me because he was a Cambridge man. He was from the upper classes, shall we say. But I've fought with men from all sides of the social spectrum. And when you're all cowering together, under fire, in a shell hole that's half full of water and bits of some of your friends, believe me, there are no social distinctions. But he wrote this poem before the war, and it says everything to me about what I was hoping for. And ere the night is born, do hares come out about the corn? Say, is the water sweet and cool, gentle and brown above the pool? And laughs the immortal river still, under the mill, under the mill? Say, is there beauty still to find, and certainty and quiet kind? Sweet meadows, for to forget the lies and the truth and the pain. Stands yet the church clock at 10 to 3, and is the honey still the tea?